Hello, welcome to the program, a special one-hour edition of Media Week, where we'll be taking an in-depth look at the global fallout from the News of the World hacking scandal and, importantly, what it means for the media here in Australia. Among our guests, we'll be hearing from Mark Day, the Financial Review's Tony Boyd, and via Barry O'Brien, and top-rated media analyst Macquarie's Alex Pollock. Later in the program, we'll, of course, wrap all the other news of the week and hear from the CEO of Southern Cross Austereo, Rhys Holleran. But first to News Corporation and a story which has truly gone global. What began with a phone hacking scandal at Britain's The News of the World has led to an emergency session of the UK Parliament and a range of calls for big changes to media ownership, regulation and privacy. We begin our coverage with a look at the worldwide impact of this story. Our co-host James Manning is here. He's the editor and publisher of Media Week. And joining us on the panel are media commentator Mark Day and at the Australian media editor Stephen Brooke. To be clear, both our guests are News Limited employees, and we should note Sky News Business is one-third owned by B Sky B, which is itself one-third owned by News Corporation. Gentlemen, thanks for being all with us for a special show. Mark, if I can start with you. You've seen your fair share of scandals in your time. Is this as serious as they come?
Yeah.
Would you like to expand on that?
Well, I'm taking a cue from Murdoch, who answered so many questions as nope, nope, and no. Yes. This is one that keeps on giving. I wrote a column in The Australian on Monday which said that I think we're getting towards the end of the first phase of this crisis, barring further bombshells. Well, by the time it appeared on Monday morning, there had been 2 further bombshells, and it's, in the words of the trade, it's a story that just keeps on giving. The impacts are profound and they are long-term.
Well, we should, I guess, just point out, you write for News Limited, and obviously News Limited has a lot of titles in Australia. There's a lot of people who have to cover this story.
And I should disclose that my superannuation company has got News Corp shares in it,
Great. I think it's important that everyone's, out and honest about who works where. And has it been a difficult story at all for you to cover, given, especially for you, you know the Murdochs well, you've worked for News for a very long time.
I've found it very difficult. I was watching the hearing the other night, and I just felt that Rupert looked like something out of The Simpsons, so glum and just a broken man. Now, to say that in a product he owns is a bit difficult. You try to get a form of words that will satisfy it. But look, I made the point in a piece this morning that the stock market is a particularly heartless beast. There is no emotion there, and I think what we're seeing out of that is a coalescence of opinion that at 80, it's time for Rupert to move on. It's time for reform of corporate governance, and part of that may well be Rupert putting in place what they all agree has to be done, and then saying, I'm now going to take on the chair take on the role of chairman. So he'll stay with the company, but in a diminished operational sense. And I think probably the market would give him and the company a big tick if that were to happen. But to say to Rupert, you've got to go, yeah, you'd have to be a brave person, yeah.
You said he looked almost a broken man at some stages. Is that because we haven't really seen him much like that before in the past? He really hasn't been in this position, and he said, humble and...
Yeah, I think so. Look, 20 years ago when he nearly fell over in that financial meltdown that News Corp went through, he was 20 years younger and 20 years more resilient, and he did bounce back stronger than ever from that.
That was a different challenge too.
A very different challenge. And look, I think the roots of this go far beyond News Corp. This is going to how the media lives in a current society. And things are changing at every level. There's a lot of concentration on what regulation should be applied to newspapers. Well, hello, what regulation should be applied to Facebook and Twitter and new platforms that have never come under a regulatory regime? And, there are calls for new inquiries. The Prime Minister saying, well, there are hard questions to be answered and need to be looked at. There's an inquiry going at the moment. It's called the Convergence Review. It's been on since the beginning of this year, and it is tasked with looking at all these issues. So I don't think we need new inquiries, but we do need to really think through where all this sits. And to just blame news and to just blame newspapers, I think, is to miss the wider point.
I want to look at the regulation issue in quite a lot more detail a little later on the program. I want to go to Stephen Brooke, the media editor, though, of The Australian. He's standing by. And Stephen, an interesting position, I suppose, for you. You've come from, what, about 8 years at The Guardian, which has really led the charge on this story in the UK.
Yes, that's correct. And I, like many News Corp employees, have found themselves writing about the Murdochs and the extraordinary events in Britain that have occurred over the past couple of weeks. But I think all media writers, no matter which paper or platform they have to write for, find themselves inevitably writing about their employers. And it was the same for me at The Guardian, and we used to get regularly criticised for bearing bad news about The Guardian by our rival papers then, The Independent, the Daily Mail, the BBC on occasions. And it's much the same in Australia with papers such as the Herald complaining about the lack of coverage News Limited papers have given to the story. But I'm very proud of the Australians' coverage, and you can see that this morning's paper we've devoted, as we have on many other days, a very large amount of space to the phone hacking scandal and the issues of privacy that are surrounding it.
Stephen, just give us some sense of your time in the UK. I mean, Rupert Murdoch mentioned this week that the opponents of B Sky B had sort of ganged up together, if you like, and caught them with dirty hands. I think the outgoing editor of News of the World mentioned, look, The Guardian's been after us for a long time. How much of that was driven by the competitive nature of the media over there?
Well, it is a very competitive environment, and News International, which is the UK division, is the biggest player in town. I think that it's true that The Guardian and other papers ganged up, if you liked, or formed a coalition which was designed to stop the news takeover of B Sky B. They were actually defeated in that goal because the government did approve the process for the takeover, which of course now News have withdrawn from. I think particularly the issue that's very pertinent in Britain is what other newspapers were involved in phone hacking. And I know from my time at The Guardian that there were other newspapers involved in phone hacking for no other reason than journalists on those papers told me that they'd been involved. And I think that News Corp and Murdoch probably feel slightly aggrieved that the massive focus on the News of the World has come at a time when other newspapers have not been subjected to the same level of scrutiny.
Mark, I suppose having seen the MPs grilling the Murdochs and Rebecca Brooks and other people involved, would you expect to see that as this story unfolds more that we will find, as Stephen has said, that particularly in the UK, that phone hacking by journalists has been widespread?
I think Stephen's 100% right that it has been going on. I doubt that the evidence will be found for that now, because since 2007 everybody involved has had, 4 years opportunity of destroying whatever evidence there may have been. And it's just human nature. If you think that you might be pinged for something, don't you? And I think a lot of that has gone on. Now, whether or not there are people on the other side who can come back and say, well, this email was sent to me or I received it and so on, but that hasn't happened yet, and you would think it would have happened by now. And exactly the same in the Australian situation. You know, there's a question about, has it been going on here? Well, there have been denials from the company. We do not believe it's been happening, but more importantly, there's nobody come out of the woodwork down the line. No junior reporter perhaps sacked for doing something wrong somewhere along the line. Nobody's come up and said, yes, I did it and I was told to do it by A, B, C and D. And I think at this stage of the whole saga, that would tend to think that the Australian companies and the American companies are clean of these charges.
Stephen, is that just a cultural thing, do you think? I mean, I haven't worked in the UK media, but from what we understand, from what we've seen, that competitive nature of Fleet Street barriers is really what's, you know, at the base of all of this. Is it very different, do you see here?
One of my first conversations with a British newspaper executive when I was going for a job, and they said, look, I know that we speak the same language, but you'll find that Australian and British newspapers are very, very different. And that was totally proved correct, because in Britain all the papers are national and they compete directly with one another. In Australia, the only national papers are the Australian and the Financial Review. Some of their readership overlaps, but they're not square on competing. Similarly, in the big metropolitan cities, the Herald and the Age have slightly different markets to the Telegraph and the Herald Sun. But in Britain, because of that massive competitive culture, there's a real fear running through newsrooms, because reporters are told stories, they have to get interviews with celebrities, they have to find out about their sex scandals and private lives, and if they don't perform, then they're out. So I can see how that kind of pressure bred fear in reporters, and that was a motivation for them to commit these illegal acts.
Mark, I'm not assuming that legal acts happen here, but what Stephen said about a national audience, we see that here with television when people say some of our best tabloid reporting, if you like, happens on the TV with the evening current affairs shows where they...
And some of our worst.
And of course you were there yourself, I think, with the ADA program that sort of dabbled in that area in the past. And the public appetite would indicate that they don't have a problem with to a degree with, you know, movie stars, politicians, sports people, with their private life being examined quite closely.
I think you're quite right there, that there was no great outcry when the phones of celebrities were being hacked and the results appeared in a little paragraph in the gossip columns, you know. But you mentioned the role of the public. You know, the worst offences in this area were committed by a newspaper which had the greatest sales and the greatest readership. So you've got to ask this information, but the public love it. Now, where do you draw the line on privacy and so on? I know a lot of politicians are scratching their head about this, but a lot of people in the media are doing exactly the same thing, because there is a public demand for it. I once wrote a column about the women's magazines making it up, inventing stories, and a response from one of the participants was, yes, that's true, but there's the public love it and somebody's got to fill the market. Well, I found that a rather gobsmacking explanation, but it is a simple one, that if there is a market for it, logically in a market economy, that expectation, that demand will be met. Well, go figure. You know, at what cost to whom?
Stephen, Brooke, what's your take, I suppose, on where to now for News International? In particular, I'm interested in your view, I suppose, for what's going to happen in the UK.
Well, we've got a hotshot executive who's come in from Sky Italia, Tom Mockridge. He's a Kiwi, spent a lot of time working as a journalist and an executive in Australia. Hasn't worked in Fleet Street or in the UK. He's been parachuted in to replace Rebecca Brooks. His job will be to steady the ship, to keep the papers making money for News International, and potentially to launch a new Sunday paper to replace News of the World, because we know that some of News International's rivals, particularly the Daily Mail group, are already looking at a down-market red-top newspaper to try and fill that gap. And there have been some incredible boosts in sales of Sunday newspapers since the News of the World shut down, and its readers, its massive audience of something like 7 million readers, have looked elsewhere to fill their Sunday newspaper reading habit. More broadly, News Corp will have to take a look at its corporate governance measures, and Mark has talked already about the future for Rupert Murdoch, and I think that if you look at companies around the world, very few of them have a chief executive who is 80 years old.
Just before we let you go, Stephen, I suppose I'm also interested, you know, you would have seen last night, on Wednesday night, the emergency session of Parliament in the UK. Is obviously a lot of questions being asked over there about the cosy relationships between politicians and the media. Do you sense that there's going to be a real cultural change?
I think that there will, certainly amongst the police, because they have major questions to answer about their shameful lack of investigation into these matters. David Cameron, as we all know, hired a former editor of the News of the World to do a job for him in his, as one of his closest advisors. So the answer simply is yes and no. I think that journalists who've worked in newspapers will still be employed by the Prime Minister and ministers to handle their press affairs. But I think that what else will happen is that there'll be a whole re-examination in public life about these connections that politicians and the police have with the media. And in the short term, at least, we'll see quite some distance put between these people. But at the end of the day, it's the job of journalists to be close to people who make the news, and politicians and the police are two groups that are very newsworthy. So it's the job of journalists to keep those kind of ties happening. Yeah,
Stephen Brooke, I have to agree with you. It's very difficult to do your job if you're not allowed to talk to people and build relationships. Stephen, we thank you. We'll let you go now, and we'll have to take a short break after that. What this all means for News Limited, the Australian arm of News Corp. Our panel continues after this.